The Golden Steve has been revived at last, and he was going to save us all. Or that's what we all thought. So this is the story. It all begins just a few thousand years ago, right at the peak of the Trail civilization. Now, the Trails were a group of villager-like beings that had massive cities all over the world, and they were thriving, as the Trails had millions of inhabitants and had some of the most advanced technology in the entire world back then. And so the Trails were likely the most powerful force in the entire overworld. But still, despite all their successes, they wanted more. And so it was with that obsession for greater power that the Trails began to dig deep within their world, attempting to gather as many valuables as they possibly could from down under. But at the same time, they didn't just dig deep. No, as they were also obsessed with reaching new heights within their world. As for the last 100 years, millions of trailers have looked up into the starry night sky and wondered what was beyond the clouds within their world, and what were those tiny dots up there. And so now, with all their advances in technology, they were finally able to start answering those questions. However, they would spend years wasting away, spending large supplies of the rarest resources, and spending millions of hours of work, all for every single attempt to be met with failure. Well, that was until one day when everything would change. As it was on one just ordinary summer morning when the Trails were just launching their second ever vessel up into the sky, hoping to change their streak of bad luck, when they finally hit something. As while that vessel was only up a few hundred blocks into the air, it hit a Steve? That was weird. As it turns out, that Steve had been hiding away within the code of the air for the last 500,000 years, and was only now, at last, awoken. Well, sort of. As well, yes, he was no longer hiding away in this dormant state in the code up in the sky. But, at the same time, he was still asleep. And so because of that, he didn't react to being summoned. And well, as he was up in the sky, he just began to fall. Oh no, this was bad, very bad, as if he didn't wake up soon, then he was going to die. And so because of that, all the trailers began to run around frantically trying to find a water bucket so that they could potentially save this strange being. However, they were unable to find one. And so, for that reason, the Steve was just getting closer and closer and closer to the ground, and he was only 30 blocks away from dying when one of the trailers found a bucket and very quickly was able to place it just below the Steve. And thus, with that, the Steve was saved. Yet, at this moment, he was still asleep, and he wasn't moving. And so it was due to this inaction by the Steve, and the fact that there was just a whole new being in the world that no one had ever seen before, that hundreds of trailers began to leave their homes, and all came to stare at this strange Steve. Now, many were confused, as they had no idea what this strange man was, or why he was up in the sky, and what he could do. And so, as there were no obvious answers, many of the trailers just stood there for several hours trying to work out what had just happened. But very soon, that would change, as from the shadows of the nearby forest, the local madman arrived. His name was Subscriber, and he was known all across the trails. But not for anything good. No, he was known for his crazy theories on life and the overworld. And so this crazy trailer went up to this strange beast and yelled out to all the trailers.
I know what this is, as this creature is our god, but he is in deep sleep. And so if we want to awake him, we can, and it's very simple, as all we have to do is to just coat him in the purest gold that we have, and then electrocute him and all the gold that surrounds him. And so if we do this, then we will have a god on our side. We have to do it.
Now, this just sounded insane to everyone around, but when they went to go and ask this madman more questions about what he just said, they were unable to, as he had just ran away. And so now the trails had two options. Either they could continue to stand there not really doing much of anything and hope for an answer to come eventually, or they could try and do what the madman had said. And so, after a few minutes of discussion, they all chose to do the latter. As, after all, it was just so oddly specific that many began to believe that it might just work. And so with that, the trailers began to transport as much gold as they possibly could from their gold reserves and move it over to their sleeping Steve. And once they were ready, they began to cover him with it. And then they placed a lightning rod just below the Steve and his golden coating, as at that time they didn't really have any power sources strong enough to electrocute all of this gold. And so for that reason, they needed to harness the power of lightning. And so, once they had completed their setup, then they just had to wait. And very luckily, they wouldn't have to wait for too long, as it was only on the next week that it began to thunder. And well, the very moment that the first bolt of lightning struck down within their world during that storm, all of the trailers started to run out of their homes, and together they all gathered around that golden orb, anticipating the strike, which very luckily they would get just a few seconds later. And so as soon as that bolt of pure electrical energy struck down onto that golden casing, all of the gold began to glow as the electricity began to flow through it. But it was glowing extremely brightly, to the point where the entire city was consumed in a golden glow. And then, just a few seconds later, it was all over, and the gold orb was no more. Instead, in its place, stood a Steve. But he had changed, as all that gold had just fused into him. And so with that, he had just become the Gold Steve. But more noticeably than just his appearance, the Gold Steve was alive, as their technique had just worked to revive him. And so, the very moment that the Gold Steve was revived, all the trailers began to bow down to him, as many didn't think that this would actually work, and because it had, they believed everything else that that madman had said, and so they all believed that the Gold Steve was a god. Now, on the other hand, the Golden Steve just stood there, being very confused with what was going on, as he just spent over 500,000 years asleep within the game's code, and so he had absolutely no idea what was happening. And so he just stood there, taking all of this in. However, as he was doing that, he felt waves of power surging through him. As, after all, he had just been fused with several tons of the purest gold within the world. And so, he just felt powerful, more so than he ever had before. And so, after a few minutes of standing still and getting used to all this new power that he had gained, the Golden Steve decided to jump forward to address all these strange trailers that were surrounding him. But as soon as he did that, he somehow began to fly. Wait, what? How did he just do that? He had no idea that he could fly? He was so confused, and so he went to lift up his arm to try and drag himself down to the ground. But as he did that, the thunderstorm just abruptly stopped. Wait, could he control the weather as well? This was strange, very strange, and so the Golden Steve just hovered there, not really moving, and was just confused by the fact that he had all these powers. But the trailers, on the other hand, well, they all began to pray down to this new deity within their world, as they were shocked to see that the Golden Steve was demonstrating his powers to them. And so with that, it would be over the next few weeks that the Golden Steve would become the god of agriculture for the trails, as after all, he could control the weather, which was a major part of farming. But not just that, as over the next few weeks, the Golden Steve had learnt of even more powers that he possessed as well. Most importantly, being his ability to summon giant concentrated rays of sun to shine down in specific areas within the world, and those concentrated rays held all of the golden nutrients that a plant could possibly need to grow. And he also had the ability to till massive areas of land, which meant that farmland could be built quicker than ever before. And so it was with all of these powers that the Golden Steve had that farming within the trails just became the most efficient that it had ever been. And so it was due to all these successes that a golden palace was built in honor of him. And that palace would quickly become the home of the Golden Steve. And well, he loved it there. As with that palace, he was given a very nice life, as he would spend the mornings tending to the farms within the world. Then he would spend the afternoons in the golden pool within his palace. And then finally, at night, he would go to sleep on a bed of solid gold. So really, it was a very nice life for the Golden Steve, and it would continue to be like that for the next few decades. Also, over that time, not only did the Golden Steve continue to be a god of farming, but he also discovered many new powers, as he had learned that he could teleport through gold ores, and that he could forge any golden tools from thin air. It was great. However, despite all the grand successes of the Golden Steve, there was something lacking from his life, as over those decades, the trailers had gotten used to the Golden Steve, and so, for that reason, they stopped respecting him. And so because of that, they no longer bowed down to him whenever he walked past. They no longer cared for him, and his once magnificent palace was now in ruins due to the lack of care to him and his possessions. And so, for those reasons, the Golden Steve just felt underappreciated, and like he was just being used by the trailers, which he really did not like. But at the same time, there was nothing really that he could do about it, or so he thought, as it was on one dark, rainy night that an evoker would make its way into the crumbling palace of the Golden Steve, and he would be able to sneak his way over to the Golden Steve's bed, where he would speak to the Golden Steve.
I know they don't care for you anymore, and they never will, as the trailers are just selfish and evil beings that only act to better themselves. But you don't have to live your life that way anymore. You can leave those monsters, and you can join me and the Illagers, and we will give you the respect that you deserve. And we can help you become an even better god within the world. Come on, you know this is what you must do. We will help you.
Now, at first, the Golden Steve was very skeptical, as he was always told by all of the trailers that the Illagers were just evil beings that had the despicable goal of controlling the entire overworld. However, at the same time, he felt that maybe what the evoker was saying was correct, as the trailers have clearly shown their lack of care for their own god. And so maybe, just maybe, the trailers were the evil ones. And so, believing that, the Golden Steve agreed to join the evokers. And well, that decision would change his life forever. As it was on that night that the Gold Steve, being led by the evoker, would leave that palace for the last time, never to return again. And together, they ventured across the world, and in just a few days, arrived at a woodland mansion. Now, the Gold Steve was quite scared seeing this mansion for the first time. However, when he walked through that door, he was met for the first time in several years with dignity and respect, as all the villagers came out of their rooms and they all began to bow down to him. And so, with that, the Steve felt safe and secure, as these villagers were showing themselves to actually be quite good beings, not the evil monsters that he has always been told that they were. And so, after the Golden Steve had accepted this fact, he was led over to a golden bedroom made especially for him. And then he went to sleep, knowing full well that this would be a new era within his life. A fact that would only be proved when he woke up the following morning. As when he did that, he found a set of 7 villagers were all there, waiting for him so that they could serve him a morning meal. The Golden Steve was shocked, as this was just so kind of them, and the trailers had never done this to him, ever. And so, after accepting this wonderful free food, he was then led over to their training room, where he was met with some of the strongest villagers that he had ever seen. And they were all there, especially for him, as they were going to train him. And so with that, it would be over the next few decades that the Gold Steve would spend every day working hard with the villagers' help to become the strongest and best version of himself that was possible. But still, it was an extremely difficult undertaking. But in spite of that, the Gold Steve loved every second of it, as he loved the fact that the villagers were actually spending their time with him, helping him, and respecting him. And so it was because of all this hard work that he was putting in over those decades that the Golden Steve became quite the warrior. But not just because of all these normal and mortal combat techniques that he was taught. No, those were useful, but something that was far more useful were the brand new offensive powers that he had developed over that time. And those powers included the following. First, he had learnt how to turn any enemy into golden statues, which would put them in a state of vulnerability and weakness and allow for an easier kill. Secondly, he had learned how to summon the sharpest golden swords in existence, which made him a very powerful opponent. And finally, was his most powerful new ability, as he had gained the know-how to summon a small sun of pure gold that would vaporize any opponent in just a few seconds. And so, all these new powers, in combination with all of his other ones, such as weather control and flight, made the Gold Steve likely the strongest deity in the entire overworld ever to exist. And so, because of all this, the villagers began to refer to him as the god of the sun and lightning. And well, once again, he loved it, as he loved that he was being shown the respect that he felt he deserved. But at the same time, he never really got the chance to show his appreciation to the illagers, which really annoyed him. However, that was all going to change very quickly, as it was on just a normal sunrise within the spring that a group of evil trailers had made their way over to a woodland mansion, and they broke into it, where they would then attempt to burn it down. And then, before anyone saw them, they ran away. And so, as no one stopped them, it was over the next few minutes that half of the woodland mansion would be engulfed in flames, with hundreds of villagers being burnt to death in their sleep. Now, very luckily, the Gold Steve was able to stop any more spreading when he woke up, as he was able to summon the rain, which, thankfully, put out the fire. But still, it didn't matter, as hundreds were already dead, and the remaining illagers were outraged, and so they wanted revenge. And thus, with that, they began to plot a counterattack on the trails. And who would be better to lead this attack than their newly trained god, the Golden Steve? And so, just a few days later, when their plans were complete, the Gold Steve, along with a large army of illagers, marched into the nearest trail city. And together, they fought the trailers. And in just a few minutes, they had won the city. And so, after that success, they moved on to the next city, and the next, and the next, and the next, and they were all very easy successes, as the Golden Steve was able to utilize all of his powers, which helped the illagers gain a massive advantage over the trails. Now, during some of these attacks, the Golden Steve was offered a new life with the trails, as many high-ranking members of the Trail Civilization offered the Golden Steve a brand new golden palace, where they also promised to love and respect him this time. But the Golden Steve just didn't care for any of these proposals of supposed respect, as he knew that they were all lying. And so he had no hard time killing them all. But still, their success story over the trails wouldn't last forever, as just a few months after the first raid of the trails, with hundreds of successful raids, the Golden Steve and his army would march into the capital of the Trail Civilization. This was it. This was the largest and strongest city within the Trails Civilization. And if they took this one, then the Trails would collapse, and thus they would have achieved their goal of revenge. However, due to all the stakes at play with this city takeover, it had very quickly become the most defended trail in all of existence, as millions of trailers had moved over to this city and were ready for the fight. And so, for that reason, this was the first city where the Gold Steve and his army actually had some difficulty winning the city, as there were just so many trailers who were determined to fight off the Gold Steve and were willing to die to do that. And so, for the first time ever, they were losing. But that wouldn't matter for too long, as the Golden Steve was going to make sure that they would not lose this battle. And so, to achieve this victory, he ordered all of his army to retreat, as he was planning to unleash his greatest attack yet. And so, he leapt up into the air and summoned a thunderstorm, which caused a premature nightfall to consume this part of the world. All of the trailers were terrified, and so they all just stared up at the sky, looking at what the Gold Steve was doing, as the Gold Steve began to access and draw the powers of the sun. And then he attempted to concentrate as much of the sun's energy as he possibly could within his hands, and then he released it. His goal was to cause a bolt of the sun's energy in the form of lightning and to make it land on the Trail civilization, which would hopefully wipe them out. However, it failed, as the Gold Steve was struck by his own blast and was therefore killed instantly. And well, the very moment that he was killed, it suddenly returned to dawn, and it stopped raining as well. Oh no. This was bad, very bad, especially for the Illager army, as not only had they just lost their great army leader and god, the Golden Steve, but they had also just lost their ability to hide within the shadows of the rainy night. And so, for that reason, all of the Illagers over the next few hours were either slaughtered by the Trails, or were very lucky and were able to barely escape. And so, once the Trails had achieved their victory over the Golden Steve and the Illagers, they then began to search for his body. As, after all, it was made from just so much gold, and they could really use it. And well, they spent the next few hours searching for it, but they just couldn't find it. And so, because of that, many began to believe that his entire body might have just been vaporized by that bolt. Well, that was until one of the young trailers found it in a bush. And so, very quickly, all the trailers began to huddle around it. They were all shocked, as all that remained of this once great god were his shoes. So they all stood there, not knowing what to do, until one of them decided to pick those shoes up. However, as soon as they began to walk closer to those boots, they just shot up into the sky and then disappeared, never to be seen again. That was very weird, but still, that was it. That was the end of the Golden Steve's story. Well, actually, not quite, as some of those villagers that had been able to escape the Trails after their defeat decided to explore the world and try and recoup the losses that they felt when the Gold Steve had died. But what they ended up finding might just have been far more powerful than the Gold Steve ever was. But to learn about their discovery, then you'll need to watch this video.